The freighter Marigold died the way most old ships did, not with an explosion or a scream of tearing metal, but with a tired, apologetic shudder, like an animal lying down because it simply could not take another step. Nolan Reyes felt it happen through the soles of his boots before the warning lights even caught up. A stutter in the deck plating. A half-second hitch in the hum that had been humming underneath his life for 11 years. He didn't need the diagnostic panel to tell him what it told him 30 seconds later. Port coupling failure. Sublight drive offline. Recommend immediate port. Yeah, he muttered, already pulling up the nearest chart. I recommend that too. The nearest port turned out to be a scrap of a settlement on a planet most freight registries didn't even bother naming twice. Kessel's Rest, a dust-colored world on the edge of a trade corridor nobody important used anymore. It had one working repair yard, a fuel depot that took longer to pump than most ships took to land, and according to the 3-line entry in his NAV computer, limited amenities. Nolan had seen limited amenities before. He didn't expect much. He got a diner. It sat at the end of the settlement's single paved road, wedged between a shuttered parts shop and a building that might have been a chapel once, its sign so sun-bleached that all he could make out was INEs, the rest of the word rubbed away by decades of grit and wind. Through the window, he could see a handful of booths, a counter, and about 4 customers total, none of whom looked like they were in a hurry to be anywhere. He was tired down to his bones. The kind of tired that came from 3 weeks alone in a cockpit with nothing but the hum of a dying engine for company, and he wanted, more than anything, a hot meal and a chair that didn't vibrate. The bell over the door gave a thin, rattling chime as he stepped inside. Nobody looked up except her. She was young, Vulpine, he registered automatically, the way you register the color of someone's shirt, not the thing that mattered most about them. Orange-furred, slight, with ears that swiveled toward him and then flattened slightly, as if bracing for something. She had an apron tied twice around her narrow waist, a rag stuffed in the front pocket, and eyes that found his and then dropped to the floor before he'd even taken 3 steps inside. Table for one, he said, because it seemed like the thing to say. Of course. Anywhere you'd like. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the clatter of the kitchen behind her. She gestured toward the empty booths with a hand that trembled, just slightly, at the edges. I'll bring you a menu. He picked a booth by the window, where he could keep half an eye on the shipyard, and watched her cross the room. She moved carefully, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. At the counter, an older man in a repair yard jumpsuit snapped his fingers at her without looking up from his data slate. Coffee. Now, not next week. Yes. Yes, of course, right away. Sora, hurry up, the man's waiting. Called a voice from the kitchen, sharp and unkind. Sora. Nolan filed the name away without meaning to. She poured the coffee with hands that shook just enough to slosh a little over the rim, and the man at the counter made a disgusted noise and shoved the cup back at her. Watch what you're doing. I'm sorry, I'll get you a new. Just wipe it up. Nolan watched her spine curl in on itself as she mopped the spill with her rag, murmuring apologies nobody was listening to. Nobody in the diner so much as glanced her way except to be annoyed at her. It was the particular, quiet cruelty of people who had decided, without ever really deciding, that someone didn't matter enough to be treated like she did. He'd flown enough routes and eaten in enough roadside dives to know the type of place this was. The kind where the same 5 people came in every day, and one of them always had somebody to be short with. When she finally came to his table, menu clutched to her chest like a shield, her ears were still low, her smile tight and automatic. What can I get for you? He glanced at the menu. Nothing fancy, the kind of comfort food you'd find in any frontier diner in the quadrant, and pointed to the first thing that looked like a real meal. This one. And water's fine, thanks. Of course. I'll have that right out. Take your time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Ship's grounded for repairs. She blinked at him, as if the sentence had been unexpected, not the information in it, but the tone. Like nobody had told her to take her time and longer than she could remember. Okay. Thank you. She disappeared into the kitchen, and Nolan leaned his head back against the booth and let his eyes close for just a moment, savoring the stillness of a room that wasn't shaking apart around him. The meal, when it came, was good. Not fancy, pan-seared root vegetables, a spiced protein loaf, a thick slice of bread, but good, made with more care than the diner around it seemed to deserve. He said so. This is really good, he told her, when she came to check on him. Did you make this? Sora froze for half a second, like the compliment had physically startled her. Yes. I do most of the cooking now. Since it's usually just me. You should be proud of it. I've eaten in a lot of places. This is better than most. Her ears rose just a little, before catching themselves, like she'd remembered not to hope for something. That's very kind of you to say. I mean it. He nodded toward the counter, where the man from earlier was grumbling at another server through his mustache. That guy give you a hard time a lot? Something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe, that he'd noticed. That he'd asked? It's fine. I'm used to it. Doesn't mean it should be that way. He said it simply, without weight, the way you'd point out a stain on someone's shirt they hadn't noticed yet, not to embarrass them, just so they know. You work hard. Anyone can see that. She didn't say anything to that. She just stood there a moment too long, rag twisted in her hands, before murmuring that she'd be back to check on him, and retreating toward the kitchen with her ears held just a fraction higher than they'd been before. A second customer came in not long after. A broad-shouldered man in a hauler's vest who took the booth across from Nolan's and immediately began complaining, loudly and to no one in particular, about the wait, the heat, the state of the roads outside. When Sora approached his table, he didn't so much as look up from his data slate. Took you long enough, he said. I don't have all day. I'm sorry, sir, I'll get your order right away. Just bring me whatever's fastest. And don't mess it up like last time. Nolan watched her nod, apologize again for something that didn't sound like it had been her fault the first time either, and hurry off toward the kitchen. He felt something tighten in his chest, not quite anger, more a kind of tired recognition, the particular ache of watching a pattern repeat itself in front of you and knowing it had probably been repeating for years before you ever walked in. When she came back to refill his water a few minutes later, he asked, quietly, Does he come in a lot? The one who just sat down. Baram? Most days. She kept her voice low, glancing toward the kitchen as if the walls themselves might report back to her boss. He's not so bad. Just impatient. Everyone's impatient out here. There's not much else to be, I suppose, when the days all look the same. That's a generous way to think about it. It's easier than the alternative, she said with a small, tired smile that told him she'd clearly had a great deal of practice choosing the generous interpretation over the accurate one. If I let myself be upset about every unkind customer, I don't think I'd have any feelings left over for the good parts of the day. Are there good parts? She considered the question with more seriousness than he'd expected. The quiet hour before opening, when it's just me in the kitchen and nobody's shouting for anything yet. The way the light comes through that window in the evening. She glanced at him, almost shy. This. Right now. Talking to someone who isn't in a hurry to be somewhere else. I'm glad I could be a good part of somebody's day, he said, and meant it more than the casualness of the sentence let on. He stayed an hour. Longer than he needed to, honestly. The yard had told him repairs would take at least 2 days, so there was no reason to rush anywhere, but mostly he stayed because there was something in the quiet, careful way she moved through the diner, half invisible to everyone but him, that made him want to sit a while longer and be the one person in the room who saw her. He asked her questions between the lulls, when the diner was quiet enough that she could linger without anyone snapping at her for it. Where she was from. The settlement, born and raised. What she liked to cook, anything with the little red spice pods that grew wild past the fence line, though nobody ever ordered the dishes that used them. Whether she'd always worked here, since she was 14, when her mother got sick and the medical bills started piling up faster than the tips did. She answered haltingly at first, waiting for him to get bored, to check his wrist unit, to cut her off. He didn't. He just listened, the way you'd listen to someone worth listening to, and slowly her sentences got longer, her ears rose higher, and once, just once, she laughed, a small startled sound she seemed almost embarrassed to have let out. "You're easy to talk to," she said, then flushed a deep russet beneath her fur, like she hadn't meant to say it aloud. "So are you," he said. "You just don't get much chance to prove it, from what I've seen." She looked down at her rag again. "Nobody usually wants to hear it." "I do." It wasn't a grand thing to say. It wasn't poetry. But something in her face shifted when he said it, like a door easing open half an inch after years of being painted shut. When he finally paid cash chits, plus a tip that made her eyes go wide, she tried to protest. This is too much, sir, I can't." "You can't," he said, sliding it across the counter before she could argue further. "You earned it. Buy yourself something nice. Or don't. Your call." She stared at the chits like she wasn't sure they were real, then up at him, and there was something so raw and unguarded in her expression that he almost looked away out of respect for it, like catching someone in a private moment they hadn't meant to have in public. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word. "Really? Thank you?" He stood, gathered his jacket, and paused at the door. She'd followed him partway, as if she couldn't quite let the moment end without saying something else, though she didn't seem to know what. "Hey," he said, and she looked up. "For what it's worth, you deserve better than how they treat you in there. I hope life gets kinder to you, Sora." He didn't know later why he'd said it. It wasn't the kind of thing he usually said to strangers. Maybe it was the tiredness talking, or the particular ache of watching someone small and bright get worn down by people too careless to notice what they were wearing away. Maybe it was just true, and he'd said it because it needed saying. She didn't answer. She just stood there, hand pressed briefly to her chest, eyes bright and wet, as the bell over the door chimed his exit into the dusty evening. He never thought about that sentence again. She thought about nothing else for 7 years. What Nolan didn't know, couldn't have known, wouldn't learn until much later, told haltingly over a dinner either of them would ever fully finish, was what that day had actually been for her. It hadn't been an ordinary Tuesday. She'd woken that morning to a message from the clinic on the far side of the settlement, informing her, in language too clinical to soften the blow, that her mother's treatment fund had run out 3 days earlier and further care would require payment up front. She'd gone to work anyway because there was nowhere else to go and no one else to cover her shift, and she'd spent the morning doing the math in her head between orders. How many more shifts, how many more tips, how many more months before the number in the account matched the number the clinic needed, and the math had not worked, no matter how she turned it. By the time the lunch rush hit, she was somewhere past exhausted and somewhere short of numb, moving through the diner on autopilot while the owner barked at her for a burnt order that wasn't her fault, while a customer complained loudly enough that half the room turned to watch her apologize for something she hadn't done, while her hands shook. Not from nerves that day, but from having not eaten since the message came in, because eating had felt like something for people who still had a reason to. She remembered thinking, somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, with a clarity that frightened her more than any of the day's small cruelties, that she could not do this anymore. Not the shift. Not the debt. Not the particular exhaustion of being a person nobody in the room considered worth being kind to. She remembered standing in the walk-in cooler for 4 minutes with the door shut, telling herself to breathe, telling herself it would pass, not entirely believing it. And then a human had walked in. Tired-eyed, travel-worn, clearly wanting nothing more than a hot meal and some quiet. The kind of customer who could have been just as short with her as everyone else, given how frayed she must have looked even trying to hide it. He hadn't been. He'd thanked her by name. She hadn't realized until later that she must have introduced herself without thinking, on autopilot, the way she introduced herself to every table, and that he was the only person that day who'd actually used it. He noticed the food, noticed her, asked her real questions and waited for real answers. He told her she worked hard. He told her she deserved better. He told her, with no more weight than someone commenting on the weather, that he hoped life got kinder to her. And she had believed him, in a way she hadn't believed anything in longer than she could remember, because he had no reason to say it except that it was true. She didn't tell him, that day or ever, how close she'd come to not making it to the end of her shift. She didn't tell him that his hour at that booth had been the thing that tipped the scale back the other way. Not fixed everything, not solved the debt, or cured her mother or silenced the owner's shouting, but reminded her, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only kindness from a stranger can, that she was a person worth being kind to. That the version of herself who mattered wasn't a fiction. That somewhere out past the dust and the debt and the diner, there were people in the universe who would look at her and see someone worth an hour of their time. She'd gone home that night and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself imagine a version of her life that didn't end at the edge of that counter. A restaurant of her own. Recipes with the red spice pods nobody let her use. A kitchen where nobody snapped their fingers at her, because she'd be the one deciding how people got treated. It took her 4 years to save enough to buy out the diner's failing owner. Another 2 to rebuild it, plank by plank, dish by dish, hiring people who'd been overlooked the way she had once been overlooked and teaching them that kindness cost nothing and changed everything. A 7th year to watch it become, against every reasonable expectation for a settlement this small, the busiest restaurant in the region, a place people cross sectors to eat at, a place with her name over the door in bright, unfaded letters, Sora's. And every single day of those 7 years, in the quiet hour before opening, she set one particular booth by the window and did not seat anyone else at it, no matter how busy the restaurant got, no matter how many times her staff gently suggested she let it go. She was saving it. For a man she was fairly sure would never come back. She kept it anyway. Nolan didn't recognize the settlement at first. The marigold, older now, patched in places, still stubbornly refusing to die, had thrown another coupling failure 2 sectors past where he'd meant to be, and the NAV computer had, with what he was fairly sure was mechanical sarcasm, routed him to the exact same forsaken repair yard on Kessel's Rest that had eaten 3 days of his life 7 years earlier. Except Kessel's Rest wasn't quite so forsaken anymore. The single paved road had grown a second one. There was a proper landing pad now, and a fuel depot with an actual line of ships waiting. He stood in the doorway of the shipyard's office, staring at it, feeling the specific vertigo of returning to a place that had grown up without him. "That new?" he asked the yard tech running diagnostics on his coupling. The tech, younger than him, local accent, faint amusement in her voice, snorted. "New? That's the best place in 3 systems, mister. You'd have had to be living under a rock." She glanced at his ship's registry. "You been through before?" "Once. 7 years ago." It was a little diner then. Barely anybody in it. Her eyebrows rose. "That's Sora's old place. She bought it out, what, 5-6 years back? Built the whole thing up from nothing. Best cook this side of the corridor. You should go. Repairs'll take till morning anyway." He should have been thinking about the coupling. About the cost of parts, about how much further behind schedule this would put him, about the long list of things a tired cargo pilot generally thinks about when his ship breaks down for the second time on the same forsaken rock. Instead, he found himself walking toward the warm light spilling out of that porch, some part of him, the part that still remembered a nervous orange-furred waitress, and a rag twisted anxiously between her hands, pulled toward it without quite deciding to be. The inside of Sora's was nothing like the diner he remembered. Warm wood, low light, the hum of a full room enjoying itself. Waitstaff moved with an ease and confidence that told him, before he'd even sat down, that whoever ran this place ran it well, and ran it kindly, if the easy laughter between staff and the genuine warmth toward customers were anything to go by. He was standing just inside the door, scanning for a hostess stand, when he saw her. She was crossing the room with a tray balanced on one arm, orange fur a little richer now, a little more filled out with the confidence of someone who'd built something real with her own two hands, and then she looked up, and saw him, and the tray very nearly went sideways. She set it down on the nearest empty table with a hand that was, he'd swear to it later, shaking, exactly the way it had shaken 7 years earlier over a spilled cup of coffee, except this time the tremor wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. She started and stopped. Her ears had gone rigid, fully upright, the way he remembered them lifting once, briefly, 7 years ago, before catching themselves. This time they didn't catch themselves. This time she let them stand. "It's you," she finished, barely above a whisper. Yeah?" He felt suddenly, absurdly nervous, like a man who'd wandered into the wrong scene of somebody else's story. "I don't know if you remember." "I remember." Her eyes had gone bright, glassy, tears rising before she seemed to have consciously decided to let them. "I remember everything." Before he could say another word, she was moving, past him, through the kitchen door, calling something to her staff that he didn't quite catch, and he stood there awkwardly amid the low murmur of other diners, wondering if he'd upset her somehow, wondering if he should just quietly leave and let her get back to her evening. She came back out less than 2 minutes later carrying a plate. He knew the meal before she set it down. Pan-seared root vegetables. A spiced protein loaf. A thick slice of bread. Exactly what he'd ordered 7 years ago, prepared, he'd learned later, from muscle memory she'd never let herself forget. "I never forgot," she said, and her voice broke clean in half on the last word. He stared at the plate. Then at her. Something in his chest, some old and dust-covered part of him, cracked open in a way he wasn't fully prepared for. "Sora," he said slowly, the name surfacing from somewhere he hadn't realized he'd kept it. You own this place?" "I do." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist, laughing wetly at herself. "I'm sorry, I don't usually—" "Please sit, you must be starving, I'll get you." "Sora." He said it gently this time, and she stopped, hands still half raised toward the kitchen. "Sit with me a minute." "Please." She sat. Word traveled through the kitchen faster than either of them realized. By the time the dinner rush thinned out, half the staff had found some excuse or another to pass by the window booth, refilling water glasses nobody had asked to be refilled, sweeping a section of floor that was already clean. Each of them stealing a glance at the human sitting across from their boss with an interest that was not even slightly subtle. "That's him?" A young Vulpine line cook, gray-furred and gangly, leaned against the kitchen doorway with poorly disguised curiosity. "The one from the story?" "Tobin," Sora hissed, mortified. "Go check on the ovens." "The ovens are fine, boss, I checked them 4 minutes ago." He grinned at Nolan, unbothered. "She tells that story every year. Around the anniversary." "Doesn't say your name, just, the Traveler. Some of us started a betting pool on whether you were even real." "He's real," Sora muttered into her tea. "Clearly." Tobin extended a hand toward Nolan, who shook it, bemused. "Tobin. I run the line. She hired me 2 years ago, when nobody else would, on account of I've got a tremor in my hands from an old injury. Everybody figured that meant I couldn't cook. Sora took one look at my knife work and put me on the fish station the same day." He shrugged, something quietly proud in the gesture. "That's sort of how she hires. You'll meet the rest eventually. We're not exactly what you'd call a conventional staff." Nolan looked around the room, really looked this time, past the warm lighting and the full tables, and began to notice things he hadn't clocked at first glance. A hostess who navigated the floor with a cane and never once apologized for the pace of it. A server whose careful, deliberate way of speaking suggested she'd been given the time and patience to find her words that most kitchens wouldn't have offered. An older Vulpine woman running the register with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been let back into a workplace after most restaurants would have quietly stopped scheduling her. You hired all of them, Nolan said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. The ones nobody else wanted to hire. Sora's ears dipped, something shy and unpracticed in the gesture even after everything she'd built. I know what it's like to be looked past. I wasn't going to build a restaurant and then do the same thing to somebody else. She glanced toward the kitchen, where Tobin had reluctantly returned to his station, still grinning. They're not just staff. I know that probably sounds sentimental for a business, but they're the closest thing to family I've had since my mother passed. We take care of each other. It doesn't sound sentimental, Nolan said. It sounds like exactly the kind of place worth crossing a broken coupling to find twice. She smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded, the kind he was starting to realize she only gave to people she trusted completely. Come on, she said, standing and holding a hand out to him. Let me actually show you the place, instead of just feeding you and crying at you all evening. She gave him the full tour once the last table had cleared, the kitchen with its mismatched but gleaming equipment, half of it repaired rather than replaced because, as she put it, things deserve a second chance before you throw them out. The small office in the back where a cork board was covered in staff photos, hand-drawn menus from years past, and, tucked into one corner, faded nearly to illegibility. A torn scrap of receipt paper he squinted at for a long moment before realizing, with a jolt, that it was his receipt, 7 years old, the tip amount still visible in her careful handwriting where she'd copied it down before the ink could fade. I kept that too, she admitted, embarrassed, when she caught him looking. I told you. I remember everything. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and pinned it a little more securely to the board, as if making sure, after 7 years, that it would stay. She told him everything that first night, in pieces that came out of order and doubled back on themselves the way real memory does when it's finally given permission to speak. She told him about the message from the clinic. About her mother. About the walk-in cooler and the 4 minutes she'd spent there, though she skated over exactly how close that day had come to being the last ordinary one, in a way that told him, sharp, sudden, and gut-punching, that it had been closer than she was willing to say aloud, at least not yet. You didn't do anything special, she told him, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. You just talked to me. Like I was a person. Nobody had done that in a long time. I don't think you even remember most of what you said. I remember some of it, he admitted. I remember telling you I hoped life got kinder to you. Her breath caught. You remember that? I think about it more than you'd expect, actually. I don't know why it stuck with me. It wasn't anything, really. It was everything, she said, quiet and fierce. You have no idea what that sentence did for me. I built. She gestured at the room around them, the warm light, the full tables, the staff moving easily between them. I built all of this because of that sentence. Because for 1 hour, one stranger looked at me like I mattered, and I decided I wanted to spend the rest of my life being the person who made other people feel that way. He didn't know what to say to that. What do you say, when a sentence you don't even remember saying with any weight turns out to have rerouted the entire course of someone's life? I kept that booth, she said suddenly, nodding toward the window seat where he'd sat 7 years ago. The same booth, he realized now, restored and polished but unmistakably the same. I never let anyone else sit there. 6 years. My staff thinks I'm sentimental. I told them I was saving it. For me? I told myself it was silly. That you were probably not even flying the same routes anymore, that you'd have forgotten the diner the moment your ship left orbit, that hoping you'd come back was foolish, honestly, the kind of thing you tell yourself in a story and not in real life. She looked at him, and there was something raw and hopeful and terrified all at once in her expression. But I kept it anyway. Every single day. Nolan looked at the booth. At her. At the 7 years folded into the space between one plate of food and another, identical plate of food. "I'm glad you did," he said quietly. "I don't think I've ever had anyone save a seat for me before." The coupling repair, which should have taken until morning, mysteriously took 3 days. Nolan told himself, and the increasingly amused yard tech, that it was a parts issue. A coil that had to be shipped in from the regional depot, some minor complication with the mounting bracket, nothing anyone could rush. The yard tech, for her part, gave him a look that suggested she saw exactly what was going on and had zero intention of correcting the story. He spent those 3 days at Sora's, not as a customer, exactly, though he tried once or twice to pay and was firmly, laughingly refused each time, but as something closer to a fixture. He helped stack chairs after closing. He fixed a stubborn hinge on the walk-in cooler door that had been sticking for months, earning a round of genuine applause from the kitchen staff. He sat at the counter during the slow afternoon hours and let Sora talk, and talked back, and found that 7 years hadn't dulled how easy it was to sit across from her. "You're good at this," he told her one evening, watching her move through the dinner rush with an ease that bore no resemblance to the shaking, apologetic girl he met years ago. She still had the softness, the gentleness that had drawn him in the first time, but layered now with a quiet, hard-won confidence that made something in his chest tighten every time he watched her cross the room. "I had a good teacher," she said, refilling his water without being asked. "1 hour, 1 customer, 1 lesson, treat people like they matter, and it changes everything. I think you'd have gotten here without me." "Maybe." She considered it, head tilted, ears swiveling thoughtfully. "But it would have taken longer. And it would have hurt more, getting here alone." She met his eyes, steady now, none of the old flinch in it. "I don't think I would have made it here alone, honestly. Not that day, at least." He didn't press her on what exactly she meant by that. He didn't need to. The shape of it was clear enough in the careful way she said it, in the way her staff exchanged glances he wasn't quite meant to catch, in the particular gravity with which they all seemed to treat the anniversary of a day none of them named directly. He understood, without being told outright, that he had walked into that diner on a day that could have ended very differently, and that the sentence he barely remembered saying had been, for her, the thin thread that kept the day from ending that way. It sat heavy in him. Not guilt, exactly. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't done anything except be decent to a stranger who deserved decency. But a kind of humbled awe at how much weight an ordinary hour could carry, if it landed at the right moment in the right life. On the second morning, before the restaurant opened, Sora took him to see the old diner's original owner, a stooped, gray-muzzled Vulpine man named Halvard, retired now, living in a small house at the edge of the settlement with a garden he tended with far more patience than he'd ever shown his staff. "You're the one from the story," Halvard said, squinting up at Nolan from his porch chair, not unkindly. "She used to be so nervous back then. Couldn't hold the coffee pot steady to save her life. I wasn't good to her, back in those days. I'll say that plainly, since she's too polite to." "Halvard, I ran that diner into the ground twice over, snapped at half the staff who ever worked for me, and didn't have the sense to see what I had right in front of me until she made me an offer I was too tired to refuse." He looked at Sora with something that might have been pride, might have been regret, most likely both at once. "She paid me fair for a business I'd let rot around her, and then she went and built something better than I ever managed in 30 years. I like to think I taught her what not to do. That's the only credit I'll take for any of this. You gave me the chance to buy it," Sora said gently. "That's not nothing. It's the least I could do, considering." Halvard's eyes moved back to Nolan, sharper now. "You treat her right, you hear me? A lot of people walked past that girl for years and never saw what was standing in front of them. Don't be one more." "I don't intend to be," Nolan said. Halvard studied him a moment longer, then grunted what might have been approval, and gestured toward the garden. "Good. Now, since you're here, she tell you I grow the best spice pods in the settlement? Hers taste of it too, if you know what to look for. Learn that from me, whether she admits it or not." "I admit it plenty," Sora said, laughing, and the visit ended with all three of them sitting on the porch for another half-hour, Halvard telling stories about the diner's early years that made Sora wince and laugh in equal measure, until the restaurant's opening hour finally pulled her away. Walking back, Nolan found himself turning the visit over in his mind. "He seemed like he genuinely cares about you," he said. "Even after everything. People aren't always just one thing," Sora said. "He was hard on me for a long time. He also gave me my start, in his own clumsy way, and he's the only person who remembers what that diner used to be before I changed it. I don't see much use in only remembering the bad parts of somebody, if there were good parts too. I'd rather hold on to both." By the second evening, he'd stopped pretending, even to himself, that he was only sticking around for the repairs. They walked the long way back from the landing pad after closing, past the fence line where the wild red spice pods grew, and she showed him the plant with the pride of someone showing off an old friend. She picked one, split it open, let him smell the sharp sweetness inside. "I use these in almost everything," she said. "Nobody at the old diner would order the dishes with them." "Too unusual," they said. "Too strange. They're the best thing on your menu," he said, and meant it. "I had the braised root stew last night. I've never had anything like it." "You're just saying that." "I'm not." He held her gaze steady. "I don't say things I don't mean, Sora. I never did." She looked away first, ears dipping, not with the old fear, he realized, but with something gentler, something closer to shy pleasure than anxious retreat. "I know," she said softly. "That's rather the whole problem, isn't it?" "What's the problem?" "You say things and mean them, and I remember every single one, for 7 years, apparently." She laughed, a little helplessly, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "It's a dangerous habit you have." He reached over, without entirely deciding to, and took her hand. It was warm, and it trembled slightly. Not from fear this time, he understood, but from the same nervous, hopeful thing he felt rising in his own chest. "For what it's worth," he said, "I meant that too. 7 years ago. I hope life got kinder to you. I didn't know it would get this kind. I'm glad it did. You had something to do with it," she said. You had everything to do with it, Nolan." He didn't say anything to that. He just held her hand a little tighter, and they walked the rest of the way back to the restaurant in a silence that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely unafraid. The trouble arrived on the 4th day, in a pressed gray suit that had clearly never once brushed against dust, riding in on a private shuttle that drew half the settlement out of their shops just to gawk at it. His name was Hendrik Voss, and he introduced himself to Sora with the particular brand of smile Nolan had learned, over 18 years of freight runs and port-side dealings, to distrust on sight, the smile of a man who had already decided how a conversation would end before it started. "Cassavet Holdings has been watching your numbers for about a year now," Voss said, setting a data slate on the counter without being invited to. "Frankly, we're impressed. A restaurant this size, in a settlement this size, generating the kind of regional draw you have, that's rare. That's valuable." "Thank you," Sora said carefully, the old wariness creeping back into her posture in a way that made something in Nolan's chest go tight and protective. "But I'm not looking to sell. I'm not talking about selling. I'm talking about scaling." Voss spread his hands, warming to his pitch. 3 more locations across the corridor, all branded under your name, your recipes standardized and licensed out. You stay the face of it, we handle the operations, the staffing, the supply chains. You'd never have to touch a stove again if you didn't want to." "I want to touch the stove," Sora said. "That's rather the point of the restaurant." Voss's smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "I understand the sentiment. Truly. But sentiment doesn't scale, Ms. Sora. And forgive me for saying so, but a settlement this remote has a ceiling. You've likely already hit it. Cassavet can take what you've built here and make it mean something bigger than one dusty corner of one forgotten trade route." Nolan, who had been quietly stacking chairs near the window booth, set the last one down harder than strictly necessary. Sora's ears had gone flat. Not with the old fear, he noted, but with something sharper, something that looked almost like the version of anger a person only gets access to once they've built enough of themselves to have something worth defending. "This restaurant isn't bigger than one dusty corner of one forgotten trade route," she said, and her voice, though quiet, didn't shake at all. "It is one dusty corner of one forgotten trade route. That's not a flaw to fix, Mr. Voss. That's the entire point. I hired people other kitchens wouldn't look twice at. I built a menu around ingredients other cooks called too strange to serve. I named the place after myself because for most of my life, nobody bothered to remember my name at all, and I wanted somewhere it would be impossible to forget." She slid his data slate back across the counter, unopened. "I'm not interested in franchising kindness. I don't think it survives the process." Voss's jaw tightened, the salesman's polish cracking just slightly at the edges. "That's a very romantic answer for a business decision." "Good," Sora said. "It was meant to be." He left within the hour, his shuttle kicking up a small storm of dust as it lifted off the settlement's landing pad, and the restaurant staff, who had, Nolan noticed, gathered near the kitchen doorway at some point during the exchange, listening without pretending not to, broke into quiet, relieved applause the moment the shuttle cleared the atmosphere. "You didn't even hesitate," Nolan said later, once the dinner rush had died down and the two of them sat together at the counter, sharing a plate of the braised stew between them. "I've hesitated about a lot of things in my life," Sora said. "Whether I was allowed to want more than I had. Whether kindness from a stranger meant what I hoped it meant. Whether you'd ever walk back through that door." She shook her head slowly, ears settling back into their easy, contented set. "But this place? What it's for? I've never hesitated about that. Not once. Not even when the offer had 4 zeros behind it. For what it's worth," he said, "I think you made the right call. Some things aren't supposed to scale. Some things are only ever supposed to fit in one small room, for the people who actually walk through the door." She looked at him for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving across her face. "You sound like you're not just talking about the restaurant." "Maybe I'm not," he admitted. "It would be inaccurate to say the romance bloomed easily, all at once, the way stories sometimes make it seem. It grew the way most real things grow, haltingly, with false starts, with both of them circling the truth of what was happening between them before either was brave enough to name it outright." Sora, for her part, was terrified of loving him for the wrong reasons. "What if this is just gratitude wearing a different face?" she asked him one night, sitting on the porch steps after closing, staring out at the dark line of the fence and the stars beyond it. "What if I don't actually, what if this isn't real, and I'm just so relieved you came back that I'm confusing relief for love?" he finished gently. She flinched at the word, even softened as he made it. "I don't know. I don't want to build something on a debt I can never actually repay. I don't want you to feel obligated to want this, because I've spent 7 years making you into something bigger than a man who was kind to me once." He considered that carefully before answering, because he understood the fear underneath it, the fear of loving a myth instead of a person, of mistaking gratitude's gravity for something with a future in it. "I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what's real and what's gratitude," he said. "But I know I've spent 3 days here not because I owe you anything, and not because I feel sorry for you, but because I like talking to you. I like watching you run this place. I like the way you argue with your suppliers and the way you scold your kitchen staff for undersalting the stew and the way you still get shy when someone compliments your cooking, even after building all this. That's not gratitude, Sora. That's just you. And I like you. Not the 7 years ago version of the story. You now today." She was quiet a long moment, wrestling visibly with whether to let herself believe it. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, in a small voice. "I've built an entire life around the idea of you. What happens if the real version doesn't fit the shape I made for you in my head? Then we figure it out, he said simply. That's what people do when they actually want to be around each other. They don't need everything to fit perfectly from day one. They just keep showing up. She studied him a long moment, the porch light catching the last of the tears drying on her face. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just worth doing anyway. He reached over and brushed a fallen strand of fur back from her cheek, gentle, unhurried. I've watched you run toward the hard thing all week, Sora. The rival buyer, the staff nobody else would hire, the recipes people told you were too strange to serve. You don't back down from things because they're difficult. Don't start with this one. This one's different. This one's my heart. I know, he said. That's exactly why I think you're brave enough for it. She let out a wet, surprised laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. You're not supposed to be good at this. You're a cargo pilot. You're supposed to be gruff and closed off and terrible at talking about feelings. I've had a lot of long, silent hauls to think about what I'd say if I ever got the chance. He admitted. Turns out 18 years alone in a cockpit is good practice for figuring out what actually matters to you, even if there's nobody there to say it to. And what actually matters to you? He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to say it right. Being somewhere I'm looked for, he said finally. Not just landed at. Looked for. I don't think I understood the difference until I walked back through that door and saw you'd kept a seat waiting for 7 years. Nobody's ever looked for me like that before, Sora. I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending I don't want to be looked for again. She reached for his hand across the porch step, lacing her fingers through his, and for a while neither of them said anything else. The settlement was quiet around them, the string lights humming faintly overhead, and it was, Nolan thought, the first silence in a long time that hadn't felt like something to fill. For Nolan, the hesitation ran along a different seam. He was a pilot, had been one for going on 18 years, since before the war, since before he'd learned any other way to be. The stars weren't just his job. They were the only home he'd ever really had, the only place he'd never had to explain himself to anyone. The idea of grounding himself, of trading the endless black for one small dusty settlement on the edge of a trade corridor nobody used anymore, sat uneasily in him, a low hum of doubt underneath the growing certainty of what he felt for her. I don't know how to stop moving, he confessed to her, the night before the Marigold's repairs were finally, truly finished. I've been flying for 18 years. I don't know who I am if I'm not in a cockpit. I'm not asking you to stop being a pilot, she said. I'm asking you to consider that maybe you don't have to choose between the stars and a place to land. Those feel like the same thing to me right now. They're not, she said gently. Not if you don't want them to be. A call came through on his wrist unit that same night. His dispatcher, Coraline, a clipped, no-nonsense voice he'd worked with for the better part of a decade, wanting to know why the Marigold hadn't logged its next departure yet. You've got a job waiting on Prendle Station, she said without preamble. High-value cargo, good pay, and a client who's asked for you specifically because you've never missed a delivery window in 6 years. What's the hold-up? Nolan stepped out onto the porch to take the call, glancing back once through the window at Sora, who was helping close out the register for the night, laughing at something Tobin had said. Repairs took longer than expected, he said, which was half true. Repairs took longer than expected 3 days ago. You still haven't logged a flight plan. A pause, weighted with the particular suspicion of someone who had known him long enough to hear what he wasn't saying. Nolan. Is this a woman? He didn't answer right away, which was, he supposed, answer enough. Coraline sighed, long and put upon, though not unkindly. You've been running cargo since before I met you. You've never once stayed anywhere longer than it took to refuel. I always figured you liked it that way. No ties, no reason to stay, no reason to leave anybody behind when the job called you somewhere else. Maybe I did like it that way, he admitted. For a long time. And now? He looked through the window again. Sora had caught him watching and smiled at him, easy, unguarded, entirely certain of him in a way that still, some nights, caught him off guard with how much he wanted to deserve it. Now I think I liked it that way because I hadn't found a reason not to, he said. I think I might have found one. Coraline was quiet a moment. You know I can't hold Prendle Station forever. If you're not flying, I need to give the job to someone else. Give it to someone else, he said, and felt no hesitation at all in saying it, a strange, unfamiliar lightness, like setting down a bag he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for 18 years. I'm not walking away from the marigold, Coraline. I'm not walking away from flying. But I need you to know I'm not going to be available for the long hauls anymore. Not the ones that keep me gone for months at a stretch. I'm looking to work closer to home from here on. Home, Coraline repeated, something almost fond creeping into her usually brisk tone. Never thought I'd hear you use that word about an actual place. Neither did I, Nolan admitted. Well, he could hear her already pulling up her manifest, already moving on to the practical shape of the problem, which was, he'd learned over the years, simply how she showed she cared. There's a regional circuit through that corridor. Short hauls, better pay per mile than you'd think, mostly agricultural and parts freight between the smaller settlements. I could route some of it your way, if you're serious. I'm serious. Then I'll see what I can put together. Don't make me regret this, Reyes. I won't, he said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt entirely certain that he meant it. The morning the marigold was finally, fully repaired, Nolan stood at the edge of the landing pad with his hand on the hull, feeling the familiar hum of the engines beneath his palm, and found that the certainty that usually came with that hum, the deep, bone-level rightness of a ship ready to fly, simply wasn't there. Sora found him there an hour before dawn, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, having clearly not slept much better than he had. You could leave without saying goodbye, she said, not accusing, just quiet. I'd understand. Ships leave. That's what they do. I wasn't going to leave without saying goodbye. He turned to face her fully. I don't think I know how to leave at all, actually. That's the problem. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine tremor still present in her hands after all these years. Not fear now, he understood, but the particular vulnerability of hoping for something you're not sure you're allowed to have. I built a life here, she said. A whole life, out of 1 hour of kindness from a stranger. I don't regret a single day of it. But I've spent 7 years wondering what it would feel like to have you actually stay, not as a memory I keep a seat warm for, but as someone actually sitting in it. She took a breath. I'm not going to ask you to give up flying. I know what it means to you. But I am going to ask you to consider that maybe the stars don't need all of you. Maybe you could give some of yourself to a life down here too. Nolan looked past her, at the restaurant glowing warm against the pre-dawn dark, at the string lights still lit from the night before, at the booth by the window he could just make out through the glass, the one she'd kept empty for 7 years, the one that had, and possibly, waited for him the whole time. He thought about 18 years of cockpits, of cargo runs through empty systems, of meals eaten alone at ports that never remembered his name, of a life built entirely around forward motion because stopping had always felt like the same thing as failing. And he thought about a woman who had built an entire restaurant, an entire life, around the idea that kindness was worth keeping a seat warm for. Who had looked disbelief and gratitude and 7 years of hope in the face and still chosen, every single day, to set that table for a man who might never come back. I've been running my whole life, he said slowly, working it out as he said it. Not away from anything. Just running, because it was easier than staying still long enough to figure out if I wanted to be anywhere in particular. I don't think I ever let myself imagine a place I'd actually want to land. And now? He looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first evening 7 years ago, except now there was nothing shy or hidden in the way she looked back. Now I'm looking at one, he said. He didn't sell the marigold. That felt, to both of them, like erasing something rather than choosing something, like pretending 18 years of his life hadn't happened rather than folding them honestly into whatever came next. Instead, he worked out an arrangement with the settlement's small trade council, short hauls, regional runs, cargo work that kept his hands on a yoke and his name in the sky without asking him to disappear for months at a stretch into the deep black. He came home, and it was home, now, in a way that startled him with how quickly it settled into the word. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, to a restaurant that smelled like spiced root vegetables and the wild red pods that grew past the fence line, to a woman who still, on the nights he was away, kept a lamp lit in the window of the booth by the window, though either of them called it saving a seat anymore. They just called it home. The year that followed wasn't without its adjustments. Nolan learned, slowly and with a fair amount of good-natured grumbling, the particular rhythms of a life that had a fixed address in it, grocery runs instead of ration crates, a kitchen that needed restocking instead of a cargo hold that needed manifesting, a bed that stayed in one place instead of a bunk that hummed with an engine's vibration through the night. He missed the deep black sometimes, in a way he didn't try to hide from her. Some nights he'd sit out on the porch long after closing, looking up at the stars he used to live among, and Sora would sit with him without asking him to explain it, because she understood, better than most, what it meant to hold on to a piece of who you used to be even as you built who you were becoming. The regional circuit Coraline had promised came through within the month. Short hauls between Kessel's Rest and half a dozen neighboring settlements, cargo runs that kept his hands busy and his name in the sky without ever taking him more than a few days from home. He came to genuinely love it in time. There was a particular satisfaction, he found, in flying routes he knew well enough to recognize the small changes in them, in being a familiar face at ports that actually remembered his name, in coming home to the same warm light every few days instead of chasing it across 100 different systems that never once looked back. Sora, for her part, learned that loving someone in the present tense was a different, harder, and infinitely more rewarding thing than loving the memory of a kindness 7 years gone. The real Nolan snored. The real Nolan left tools scattered across the porch and forgot, more than once, to tell her when a run was running long. The real Nolan also learned every one of her staff's names within a week, fixed the walk-in cooler door a second time without being asked, and never once, in an entire year, failed to tell her the food was good, even on the nights it wasn't her best work. She decided, somewhere around the 6th month, that she loved the real version considerably more than she'd ever loved the myth. Which was, she told him once, laughing, extremely inconvenient, because now I have considerably less to complain about. The anniversary came around again, as anniversaries do, and this time Sora didn't spend it alone in a walk-in cooler counting the minutes until she could breathe normally again. She spent the morning of it standing on the restaurant's covered porch and addressed the color of the wild red spice pods, watching the entire settlement. Nearly the entire settlement, it seemed, plus a fair number of ship crews who'd happened to be grounded that week and simply refused to leave once they heard what was happening, crowd in among rows of borrowed chairs strung with the same string lights that hung along the eaves every ordinary evening. Tobin had insisted on catering, on the grounds that nobody's paying an outside kitchen to cook for the boss's wedding when we've got a perfectly good one right here, and had spent 3 days perfecting a version of the braised root stew specifically for the occasion, muttering the whole time about how it needed to be good enough for the anniversary of the anniversary. Nolan stood at the end of the aisle in a jacket that fit him a good deal better than the travel-worn one he'd first walked into the diner wearing 7 years and 1 year ago, watching Sora come toward him past rows of people who had, each in their own way, been given a second chance by the same woman who was now, and possibly, walking toward him. "You look terrified," she murmured, when she finally reached him, low enough that only he could hear it. "I've flown through a supernova remnant with a failing hull," he murmured back. "This is worse." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that had taken him 3 days to earn the first time and now came easily, often, without her seeming to notice she was giving it away for free. "Good," she said. "I'd hate for this to be less terrifying than deep space." The officiant, the settlement's aging magistrate, who had known Sora since she was a girl sweeping floors after school to help with her mother's bills, kept the ceremony short, at Sora's request. "I've waited 7 years for one conversation," she told him, when they were planning it. "I don't need to wait through a long speech to have this one too." When it came time for the vows, Nolan didn't recite anything prepared. He tried, in the weeks leading up to it. Had written out 3 different drafts, all of which felt too small for what he meant, and in the end simply said the truest thing he had. "7 years ago I told you I hope life got kinder to you," he said, holding both her hands in his. "I didn't know, when I said it, that I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to be part of the answer. But I'd like to. Every day, if you'll let me. I'm not going anywhere, Sora. Not for good. Not ever again." Sora's vow was shorter still. "You saved my life once without knowing it," she said, voice steady despite the tears already falling. "I don't need you to save it again. I just need you to keep sitting in that booth. For the rest of it. That's all I've ever wanted." The whole porch erupted, Tobin loudest of all, the old woman at the register openly sobbing into a napkin she'd clearly brought for exactly this purpose, as Nolan kissed her, 7 years and 1 year late, and exactly on time all at once. They held the reception in the restaurant itself, tables pushed together into one long, laughing, over full length running from the kitchen doors clear out to the window booth, which, for the first time in 8 years, was finally, officially, no longer being saved for anyone. It didn't need to be. The person it had been waiting for was sitting in it, an arm around his wife, watching the found family she'd built over 6 hard years of rebuilding past plates of stew and stories back and forth across a table that had once seated one lonely traveler and now, somehow, comfortably sat 40. Late in the evening, when most of the settlement had drifted home and only the staff remained, clearing tables with the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who had nowhere else they'd rather be, Sora slipped her hand into Nolan's and drew him out onto the porch, into the cool dark beyond the string lights. "Regrets?" she asked, only half joking. "One," he said, and she looked up at him, startled, before he continued. "I regret it took a broken engine coupling to bring me back. I should have found my own way here a lot sooner." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder, looking out past the fence line to where the wild red spice pods grew on in the dark, unbothered as ever by anything except the wind. "You found your way exactly when you were supposed to," she said. "That's rather the whole point of the story, isn't it? Kindness doesn't need to be fast. It just needs to be real. It'll find its way back around, given enough time." 7 years is a long time to wait for anything. It was worth every day of it, she said, and meant it completely. "I'd have waited 7 more. I told you that already." "I know." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the warm, familiar smell of the restaurant that had become, against every reasonable expectation either of them had ever held for their own lives, home. "You won't have to. Not this time. Not ever again." Outside, the string lights swayed gently in the evening wind, and somewhere past the fence line, the wild red spice pods grew on, unbothered by the small, quiet miracle unfolding in the warm light of a restaurant that had once been nothing more than a nearly empty diner at the edge of a forgotten world, a place where, once, a tired stranger had looked at an overlooked young woman and seen someone worth an hour of kindness. It had been enough to change everything. It still was.